Let's begin with a structural overview. Welcome to another lecture. I am Professor Alexei, and today we consider Marcia Lucas, a film editor whose fingerprints are on the pulse of New Hollywood, and quite specifically on the heartbeat of Star Wars. With me is Priyanka, who will ask the deceptively simple questions that, as it were, keep us honest.
Thank you, Professor. I'm curious about how someone behind the scenes can change what audiences feel on such a big scale. Like, we watch the same shots, but somehow the editor makes them land.
To frame our discussion, a film editor fundamentally assembles raw footage into a coherent narrative. In simpler terms, editors decide what we see, in what order, and for how long. From these, tone, character, and emotion emerge. In this context, a few technical terms matter. Dailies are the unedited reels from a given day of shooting. Editors review them to understand coverage and options. A rough cut is the early skeletal version of the film, where major structural choices are tested. And in the case of Star Wars, Industrial Light and Magic, ILM, supplied visual effects that the edit had to integrate. Unusually, Marcia's cut of the Death Star battle became a blueprint ILM worked to. That is to say, the sequence was first editorial architecture, and second, a plan for effects.
So basically, editing is story engineering. You decide when to breathe and when to sprint, and audiences feel that timing as emotion.
Exactly. We observed that Marcia Lucas specialized in emotional clarity and payoff timing. Her colleagues routinely cited her instinct for story rhythm. She calibrated when tension should crest and when a reaction shot would convert pressure into catharsis. In fact, her famous guidance on Star Wars was that the last-second return of Han Solo had to trigger a cheer, or the film would fail to land with audiences. This is editing as audience psychology, not merely splicing. Moving forward, why does this matter? Because her decisions shaped the success of one of the most influential films in American cinema, and by extension, the industrial workflows around blockbusters. The lesson for the field is clear. Editors do not simply tidy. They can rescue, reorient, and to some extent, author the film's experience within the director's intent. Historically, such contributions by women have been underappreciated in a male-dominated industry. Marcia Lucas's case is a salient example, later reframed by peers and critics who called her the secret weapon of Star Wars.
I think the next thing we should talk about is how she even got there, because it sounds like an unlikely path.
Let's start with the history. Marcia Lou Griffin was born in Modesto in 1945. The surprise is her entry point. A California state employment office redirected her from a museum job to an apprentice film librarian at Sandler Films. By age 20, she was assistant editor, cutting promos and trailers, which is, as any editor will tell you, the boot camp of impact per second. She apprenticed under Verna Fields, worked on government documentaries, met George Lucas, and married him in 1969. Their professional and personal lives were intertwined. She assisted on THX 1138, later critiquing it as emotionally cold, a telling foreshadow of her editorial priorities. American Graffiti in 1973 brought her an Academy Award nomination. Then came Martin Scorsese's Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, Taxi Driver, BAFTA nominated, and New York, New York. And centrally, Star Wars, where she replaced the initial editor, John Jimson, mid-production. On to our next point. In mid-1976, George Lucas dismissed Jimson, concluding that his approach did not align with the documentary-style footage and the hard cutting it required. Marcia Lucas was assigned the Battle of Yavin, the Death Star assault, to distill pages of script into a coherent, escalating engagement. Over roughly 8 weeks, working from vast amounts of cockpit and radio dialogue, about 40,000 feet, she built a cross-cutting geometry that ILM then executed against. Richard Chew came aboard to restructure the first hour. Paul Hirsch joined on Brian De Palma's suggestion to manage workload. The result is the sequence architecture we now treat as inevitable. In 1978, Marcia Lucas shared the Academy Award for Best Film Editing for Star Wars. She would later focus on the emotional scenes in Return of the Jedi, alongside Dwayne Dunham and Sean Barton, applying the same sensitivity to character culmination. Additionally, in Raiders of the Lost Ark, she identified the missing emotional coda, prompting the reshot final scene with Marion and Indy.
And the Han Solo cheer moment you mentioned earlier. That was her calibration for the North Point Theatre test screening, right?
Correct. She warned that if the audience did not cheer at the precise instant of Han's return, the movie's emotional contract would fail. This is not trivial flourish. It is the payoff to a 2-hour setup of risk, sacrifice, and doubt. Editors like her ensure that cause and effect are felt, not merely documented. Before we get to the complexities, a brief personal note. As a mathematician who plays chess badly but earnestly, I admire her editorial method. She establishes the position clearly, then prunes the game tree so only a few winning lines remain. The Death Star cut is essentially a proof by induction. Small victories, escalating stakes, a final move that must resolve exactly on time, or the proof fails. This logically leads us to 3 questions. First, historically, how and why did Marcia Lucas restructure critical sequences in Star Wars? Second, counterfactually, what if Obi-Wan Kenobi had not died? And third, why have her contributions been underappreciated? And what would adequate recognition look like?
Building on that, can we maybe now look at the first one? How do we know her decisions mattered in the restructure? And what evidence supports the specific choices?
Let's transition to another aspect. The historical record shows a mid-production editorial pivot. George Lucas replaced Jimson, brought in Marcia Lucas, and later Richard Chew and Paul Hirsch, establishing a distributed problem-solving unit. Marcia's immediate assignment, the Death Star battle, was not mere trimming but design. She created the sequence's geography and tempo so ILM could plan shots. Colleagues including Mark Hamill and John Milius publicly credited her as crucial to the film's final shape. Moreover, she argued for Obi-Wan's death and for the calibrated timing of Han's rescue beat. These are not marginal choices. They govern how the audience processes hope and loss. We can infer their impact because the film's early assemblies underperformed emotionally, and after the recut, the same story provoked cheers. That delta is editorial authorship within a collaborative framework.
I've been wondering about this. When an editor sits with 40,000 feet of cockpit dialogue, how do they choose? Is it taste, or are there systematic rules?
It's important to understand that editorial judgment is both intuition and method. First, point of view. We cut so the audience knows whose turn it is to feel the risk. Second, geography. We establish where we are and what success means, so orientation never collapses. Third, escalation. Each pass must be closer to failure or victory than the last, otherwise the sequence plateaus. Marcia Lucas applied these constraints rigorously. She then used reaction shots and radio callouts as a metronome. Finally, she tested against audience response. When the North Point screening failed to generate the right surge, she adjusted timing. In simpler terms, design, measure, refine. It is the scientific method in art, if you will. Speaking of design, the production timeline complicates authorship. Marcia left near the end of 1976 to edit Scorsese's New York, New York. Accounts vary as to whether it was around Thanksgiving or closer to Christmas, while Chu and Hirsch carried forward other sections under George's supervision in San Anselmo. This sort of overlap is normal, but what remains unmistakable is her architectural imprint on the finale and her insistence on emotional clarity as a guiding principle.
So yeah, moving on. The counterfactual. If Obi-Wan didn't die, what changes in the story we all think we know?
Let's proceed to the next point. The decision for Obi-Wan to die and then guide Luke spiritually clarifies the hero's independence and enlarges the Force as a narrative principle. Without that sacrifice, we risk two problems. First, mentor overshadow. Obi-Wan could solve too many problems, compressing Luke's growth. Second, mythic ambiguity. The Force as a continuing presence would be less palpable if not experienced through loss and voice. Marcia Lucas emphasized the utility of the mentor's death. George Lucas was already considering it, and her push helped solidify the beat. The resulting arc gives us a Luke whose agency is earned. The Battle of Yavin becomes not a mission supervised, but a rite passed.
What if we thought about it like this? If Obi-Wan lived into the next films, would the later revelations and conflicts, like Luke's inner struggle, have the same weight?
Arguably not. The mentor's absence creates the vacuum in which Luke must hypothesize his own moral compass. It also concentrates the spiritual guide function into a voice and presence that appear at moments of crisis, which is more resonant than constant supervision. In practical terms, the narrative gains aerodynamic efficiency, fewer expository scenes, more interior stakes. We observe, too, that subsequent films rely on that initial sacrifice to justify Luke's growth. Remove it, and the structure sags, like an over-engineered bridge carrying too little tension to hold its own form.
Okay, so the third question. Why did it take so long for people to talk about her this way? And are women editors better recognized now?
Let's shift focus. Underappreciation has several sources. First, the editor's art is invisible when successful. The better the job, the less we notice the seams. Second, the 1970s blockbuster era rewarded directors as auteur narratives, and editors, especially women, receded into the footnotes. Third, Marcia Lucas paused her career in 1978 to prioritize family, reducing the number of marquee credits that typically consolidate a public brand. Meanwhile, some of her contributions, like interior design of Lucasfilm workspaces, were real but off the creative radar. And yet peers spoke up. Mark Hamill and John Milius credited her, and media later called her the secret weapon of Star Wars. Recognition is improving, but the historiography still undercounts editorial agency.
Maybe it's just me, but I find it striking that she also critiqued later films in the franchise. Does that tell us something about her standards?
Indeed. In later interviews and accounts, she criticized elements of the prequels and sequels on grounds consistent with her editorial ethos, character dynamics, emotional logic, and the earning of big moments. She objected to choices that, in her view, were insufficiently prepared on screen. Agree or disagree, the through line is coherence from setup to payoff. As to recognition, mentorship lineages matter. Verna Fields, her early mentor, is one pillar. Building curricula that foreground such editorial genealogies, assembling annotated cuts for pedagogy, and credit tracking and guild metadata would improve visibility. In conclusion, research should move from anecdote to archive. Screening notes, test audience data, and ILM shot logs align to edit decisions. Then the record reflects the work.
That was helpful to think through, actually. Also, I didn't know she helped fix the ending of Raiders, which is such a neat example of an editor spotting the missing heartbeat.
To summarize, a film editor shapes experience, and Marcia Lucas shapes Star Wars. She entered the field via an employment office, rose quickly, and became a pivotal collaborator across George Lucas, Martin Scorsese, and others. She suggested Obi-Wan's sacrificial beat, architected the Death Star battle over 8 weeks of meticulous cutting, insisted on the Han Solo cheer as a make-or-break payoff, won the Academy Award for Best Film Editing, and later brought emotional clarity to Return of the Jedi. She also identified the closing beat Raiders needed. Our 3 questions considered how she restructured Star Wars, why Obi-Wan's death matters to myth and character, and how we might correct the historical undervaluation of her role. For further study, we recommend tracing the evolution of editing techniques where the cut precedes the effect. Star Wars is a case study in editing dictating VFX. Marcia Lucas passed away in 2026. Her legacy continues to instruct anyone who edits with the audience's heartbeat in mind.
So, I guess that kind of sums it up. Thank you for listening, and thank you, Professor.
This concludes our lecture for today. Until next time.